So hello everyone. I think we're gonna kick off. So I'm Anna Valdivia. I'm a lecturer in government and policy at the Oxford Internet Institute. And to everyone online and in the room, welcome to Technocolonialism, when technology for good is harmful. We are delighted to have Professor Mirca Madianou with us today to discuss technocolonialism, capturing how the convergence of digital infrastructure with humanitarian bureaucracy, state power, and market forces reinvigorates and reshapes colonial legacies. So, Mirca Madianou is a professor in the Department of Media, Communication, and Cultural Studies and co-director of the Migrant Futures Institute at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her research focuses on the social consequences of communication technologies, infrastructures, and artificial intelligence in a global south context, especially in relation to migration and humanitarian emergencies. So for your awareness, the event is going to be recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. The presentation will run about 30-40 minutes, and after that, we're going to have like a Q&A session. So just bear in mind that we are going to record and that's going to be like publicly available. So thank you very much for being here, and Mirca, the rest is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you for the invitation and thanks for coming. I know it's the last day of term, so I'm aware how challenging this time is. So I begin the book with an example. So I'll start my talk with that same example because I think it sets the tone for what I'm trying to capture with this work. So in 2017 and 2018, over 1 million Rohingya refugees arrived in Bangladesh, fleeing genocide in Myanmar. And in 2018, the United Nations Agency for Refugees, UNHCR, conducted a registration of all refugees in the Bangladesh camps, collecting their biometric data. And so biometric registrations have become standard in the humanitarian response to refugee flows. It's one of the first things that happens when a refugee comes into contact with UNHCR. They are asked to give their biometric data. So the Rohingya registration was controversial and led to protests in the camps. And it was controversial because refugees were very concerned that their data could be shared with the Myanmar government in the future, thus endangering them if there was any repatriation going forward. So in November 2018, these protests culminated in a strike, and the Bangladesh government responded quite forcefully by sending in the police, who clashed with the protesters. And the next day, the biometric registrations continued as normal. So this example really encapsulates both the pervasiveness of, but also the violence associated with digital technologies in humanitarian contexts. With over 100 million displaced people globally, and over 300 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, and those numbers keep going up every year. So the humanitarian sector is facing huge challenges. Another great challenge, of course, is the deep cuts that have been happening in international aid budgets. We know about the dismantling of USAID and so on this year. So as these, cuts, begin to bite, and as humanitarian emergencies proliferate, the sector is facing huge challenges, and digital technologies and artificial intelligence are proposed as solutions to these challenges. So biometric technologies are just one example, right? We have multiple other applications, from blockchain to chatbots to algorithmic decision making about who deserves aid and who doesn't. So these are just some examples that I can, just to give you some examples. And so we've seen, this proliferation of technologies, which are often sort of bundled under this kind of term, technology for good, or AI for good. So in order to make sense of these practices, I've been developing this notion of technocolonialism over the last few years, and it's the title of the book. And I draw on 10 years of fieldwork in 10 years of fieldwork with humanitarian workers, with tech companies, digital developers, entrepreneurs, government representatives, policymakers, and affected communities themselves. So the book synthesizes two different projects through which I have kind of followed the trails of data from affected communities to aid organizations, to tech companies, to donors, and following the trails of data really illuminated the power relationships between these different kind of actors or stakeholders. And so that's kind of the approach I took. I'm not going to talk about the two projects per se, with any give you much detail on the projects here, because I really want to focus more on the argument, but we can I can elaborate more in the Q&A. So what do I mean by technocolonialism? And hopefully, does this, oops, should I use this? It's okay. We can see how we can move the slides along, but what do I mean by technocolonialism? Should I use, oh, oh. There you go. Okay. Oh, thanks. Okay, I'll keep using that. Thank you, Helen. So, technocolonialism really refers to how digital innovation, data and AI practices entrench power asymmetries and engender new forms of violence and new inequities between people in global majority and global minority worlds, or what we call the global South and the global North. So, technocolonialism really illuminates this convergence of digital developments with humanitarian structures, state power, and market forces, and the extent to which they reinvigorate and rework colonial relations. So through the term technocolonialism, I recognize that phenomena like displacement, migration, humanitarianism, but actually also technology itself are steeped in colonial relations. So, just take humanitarianism, for example, right? So, oops, sorry, now I went to, that was too, applied too much pressure. So let's look at humanitarianism. So humanitarianism is deeply entangled with colonial histories. It emerged in the colonial expansion of the 19th and 20th centuries. And even though today we understand humanitarianism in moral terms, we still encounter the same fundamental asymmetry between humanitarian workers or humanitarian officers and former colonial subjects. And this fundamental asymmetry, I think, is really reminiscent of this kind of structure of empire and the structure of colonialism, this kind of unequal social order that has shaped colonialism and empire. So technology and science are also part of colonial genealogies. Science, of course, has been integral to the civilizing mission of colonialism, a tool used to justify colonial rule. And science is also a tool that has been used to mold colonial subjectivity. So not just a tool, really, but actually something much more constitutive of colonialism. And this happens, of course, through systems of classification, right? Which, and I'll return to this importance sort of the work of classifications later in my talk. So AI today, is also part of these larger genealogies of enumeration, of measurement, of classification that were originally developed by imperial powers to control colonial subjects. And, I think a typical example here is biometrics, which was, of course, developed in the context of the British Empire to control and manage colonial subjects in India. And, of course, the fact that biometrics is used today to, again, control and manage othered bodies, whether that's refugees or other humanitarian subjects, again, is evidence of this durability of colonial relations. And then infrastructures, and this is a term to which I will return to later in my talk, are also steeped in colonial relations. And of course, the typical example is the telegraph, right, which kind of mapped onto the geography of the British Empire. And later, of course, that provided the footprint for the internet. So when I talk about colonialism, really, I'm really referring to an ongoing structure, right? It's really an ongoing structure of domination, which is evidenced in the persistent practices of othering, in in the epistemic violence of Eurocentric systems, which are imposed on sort of local cultures, and then the forms of racial discrimination, which which become codified through these practices. So all these kind of also echo what Quijano calls coloniality of power. But I really want to emphasize that I'm not really referring here to any particular sovereign empire, but really to this kind of much more diffused structure of domination. And I really want to also emphasize that when I talk about colonialism, I'm not talking about any new phase of colonialism. What I argue is that colonialism has, colonialism persists. Empires have collapsed, but their logics and practices have survived and permeate contemporary practices like humanitarianism and technological practices as well, which in turn rework, these colonial legacies. I also want to say that, and maybe this is already obvious, but I'm not really talking about colonialism as a metaphor in this context, which would not be appropriate given the violence associated with colonialism. To talk about colonialism as a metaphor would be to depoliticize the term and the phenomena that it describes. But I think we need colonialism as a framework to understand why, technological experiments take place in refugee camps, which are typically in global south contexts. We need colonialism as a framework to understand why there is no informed consent in a refugee camp, where to refuse to give your biometric data is essentially to refuse to receive aid when you have no alternatives for survival. I also want to say that this isn't really an argument about neocolonialism, although of course what I'm describing is very close. Neocolonialism is a cognate term. Technocolonialism was really part of my effort to emphasize the work that technology, whether that's data or AI or other practices of computation, were doing in this process, right? So I really wanted to capture that there was something about this process of infrastructuring, as I will call later on, or this process of these technological processes that was really reworking colonial legacies and genealogies in specific ways, kind of making them more tangible, bringing them to the surface. And that's why I felt we needed a term like technocolonialism. And just to be clear, because colonialism, of course, is characterized by violence, and in its we know that from the work of many scholars. Technocolonialism is about violence. It's a form of structural violence because it's violence that is addressed or concerns specific groups of people. So, on the basis of their gender, their race, their age, or ethnicity, class, and so on, or where they live in the world. But it is also actually a form of physical violence, as we saw in the first example with the Rohingya protests. And state violence wasn't too far away from that kind of humanitarian intervention. And just to say that, and you may know this already, but that in 2021, a couple of years after those protests, it transpired that actually the Bangladesh government had shared the biometric data with the Myanmar government. So the protests were completely, the protesters in the camps were not, they were very justified in their concerns that their data could be used. So we can already see the different players here, the different actors, right? On the one hand, we have, of course, humanitarian organizations, and by that I'm referring to the United Nations intergovernmental organizations and their UN agencies, but also, of course, large NGOs like, Oxfam, you know what I'm referring to. We also need to remember the role of the state is absolutely crucial here. States are the main donors to all these various humanitarian organizations, but states are also host governments for refugees and so on. So they're they become involved in these two ways in this kind of field. And then, of course, we have market forces, including the role of tech companies, which are very involved in public partnerships with humanitarian organizations, but also through their own philanthropic wings, which somehow become quasi-humanitarian organizations themselves. So I think this is really important because I really want to emphasize, as I hope was evident also in the definition of technocolonialism earlier in an earlier slide, that when I talk about technocolonialism, it's really about the convergence of the state or state power, market forces, humanitarian bureaucracies, and these imaginaries around technologies. It's not just about the role of tech companies and digital capitalism, because I often feel sometimes the term the data colonialism or digital colonialism might be used to emphasize the importance of digital capitalism and tech companies, the power of tech companies. But I really want to emphasize here how, the role of the state and humanitarian organizations is absolutely key for what I'm trying to capture with this term. So I've identified 6 logics which help kind of provide a framework for my analysis in the book. And I'll just go through them very quickly here, starting with the logic of humanitarian accountability, which is kind of behind this assumption that the interactive nature of technologies will correct the deficiencies of humanitarianism and facilitate the participation of affected communities in their own recovery. Because humanitarianism has been criticized for a long time for being sort of very asymmetrical, for reproducing asymmetries, creating new dependencies, disrupting local societies. Authors have even described it as a form of neocolonialism. So digital technologies have been sort of framed as a way to kind of overcome some of these issues and democratize humanitarianism. So that's one sort of logic that pushes for the development of digital technologies in the sector. The other logic that pushes for the adoption of biometrics and AI and other technologies is the logic of audit. And the logic of audit really stems from the constant demand for metrics which humanitarian organizations must submit to donors in order to secure more funding. There is, so in some cases, even every 3 months, organizations or their representatives have to prepare new applications, either for the renewal of funding or for new funding, and they have to provide evidence, a bit like what we do in universities too, like, constantly having to provide feedback and data to justify, various practices or funding applications. But this is a constant flow of sort of impact demand. And again, the metrics of these platforms provide this. So biometrics, for instance, has been one of the reasons biometrics has been introduced was that it was going to provide robust audit trails to donors who demanded zero tolerance to fraud, right? So biometrics, it was one way of biometrics was one way of achieving that. And then, of course, we have the logic of capitalism, which is about this kind of dynamic entry of the private sector in the humanitarian space, and these ubiquitous public-private partnerships, which, of course, the most notorious one is the one between the World Food Programme and Palantir. But this is just the tip of a much larger phenomenon because there are thousands upon thousands of such partnerships in the sector. Now, the idea that there can be technological fixes to complex social problems encapsulates this or exemplifies this logic of technological solutionism, which really puts problems before solutions. The emphasis really here is about finding these problems for solutions rather than the other way around. And this is kind of, again, illustrated by this quote by one of my interlocutors from the aid sector, who refers here to blockchain in the period of kind of the height of its hype cycle around 2018-19, where you'd go to these industry events and people would say, we have this great idea, this great application. Can we find a problem? to apply to. Rather than saying, here's a problem we need to address, let's try to think how we might go about it. And coupled with the logic of capitalism, of course, solutionism leads to the normalization of technological experiments in these at-risk settings. So the other logic, of course, is the logic of securitization, which primarily concerns the role of the states and its use of technology to make populations legible. Of course, securitization is also big business, as I'm sure you know, and so it is also linked to capitalist logics. And in fact, all these logics intersect. This is just an analytical distinction. The interesting thing is that they kind of connect together in all sorts of ways. And securitization is particularly relevant to the response to refugee flows and the use of biometric technologies. Now, as always, structures of control produce contestation. So the final logic is the logic of resistance. It's not a logic that explains the push for digital technologies like the other five, but I think it's an integral part of this framework because we cannot understand technocolonialism without understanding resistance to its practices. And this was evidenced in the Rohingya strikes I mentioned earlier, but it's actually also evidenced in much more muted forms of protest that occur sort of below the radar in the micropolitics of everyday life, what I call in the book mundane resistance. And if we have some time, I'll try to say a few words about what I mean by that at the end. So as I said already, these logics intersect to produce this dynamic of technocolonialism. And in the book, I explore various ways through which these digital technologies and computational practices rework these colonial relations. And that happens not just through data extraction, which has often been emphasized when we talk about colonialism and coloniality, but actually also through extracting value from experimentation, crucially through this epistemic violence by imposing Eurocentric frameworks on local settings and validating local forms of knowledge, by this kind of imposition of a Western gaze on other bodies, by this idea of enchantment of technology. I have a chapter or half a chapter on that, which again occludes this power asymmetries, and this idea of this kind of everyday humiliation that happens through this notion of infrastructural violence, which I will explain in a minute. So, this is this is the table of contents, the book chapters, and sort of you can see how the argument unfolds. I've already taken you through the logics of digital humanitarianism, and I'm going to say a few words about biometric infrastructures because they have become the kind of ubiquitous technology that underpins so much and so many services in the humanitarian sector. And then I'm going to move on to talk about experimentation and a particular form of experimentation I call surreptitious experimentation before looking at ideas of infrastructural violence and resistance. So I'm doing a bit of a selection here because of in the interest of time. So let's talk about biometric infrastructures. And to understand how ubiquitous biometrics is in the sector, I'll give you an example. Actually, this is from my current fieldwork, which is in a refugee camp at the border between Thailand and Myanmar, which is sort of Western Thailand, right at the border. And there are Karen refugees there who have fled civil war and conflict in Myanmar. And we were looking at digital ID systems in the camp. And so just to show you how ubiquitous biometrics are in these settings, let's take a participant, let's call her Nomin. So Nomin, in order to get a kilo of rice, she will have to use facial recognition in order to authenticate herself and collect her ration. She will have to use facial recognition to collect charcoal in order to cook that rice. She has to scan her iris in order to see a nurse or a doctor at the local hospital. And of course, there are the other uses of biometrics, for registration purposes and so on. So there is this kind of trivialization of biometrics whereby you encounter the biometric reader in the camp, several times a day, possibly, and you have to constantly prove who you are in order to access basic services. Of course, as we know, rather than being perfect identification technologies, as they're often referred to, biometric systems codify existing forms of discrimination. They privilege whiteness because they're based on this notion of prototypical whiteness. These technologies have been trained mostly on white faces, and therefore there is a much higher margin of error when measuring othered bodies, whether that's in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, race, class, disability, and so on. And of course, we know this from the wonderful work of authors like Joy Bolomwini and Timnit Gebru and Simone Brown and Shoshana Magnet and others. Of course, an identification error in the camp can have devastating consequences. If, let's say, you're not eligible to collect your food, your rations, and when you have no other means to sustain yourself. But I think there's something also even deeper that is going on here. Although I'm not discounting the inconvenience or even the necropolitical aspect of kind of not being able to collect your food or see a nurse. Those delays can be devastating. But what we also see is that these technologies produce race, and this is, I think, evident when we look at quotes from refugees like No Gayler or No Portu, who tell me there is an error with my face, or my face is not valid. And that's when they try to, get their face read by the biometric reader, and that doesn't work. And so what we see here is, of course, there's nothing wrong with their face. The problem is the machine, which has been trained on white faces and doesn't recognize many people in the camp, and of course also, interestingly, many women in the camp. But the problem, but what we see here is that there is this internalization of inferiority. People internalize the machine error and treat it as their own sort of deficiency. And this is really, for me, really an illustration of what Fanon meant by epidermalization, right? Which is this internalization of inferiority as a result of racism, and what Simone Brown called digital epidermalization, which is the imposition of race on the body through digital means, right? This wide gaze that the machine sort of carries. So the lack of meaningful consent in biometric registration further compounds some of these inequities. Even when, and this is a big when, there is a tick box that says, I consent to my data being used, and that doesn't always, even that box doesn't always exist. But even when it exists, there is no box to say, I opt out, right? Because to opt out means that you're not then part of the system, which will give you aid. And again, you have no option to work or anything like that. But you can see the presence of a tick box that you can tick that you opt in, and that you consent for the data to be used is almost like a veneer of participation, right? Which legitimates practices. But as I said, it's big if it doesn't even that sometimes that's not there. The permanent records that afforded by biometrics enable this surveillance of refugees in perpetuity. And this is really important because especially UN data policies don't have, they don't really have any sunset clauses, so the data stays in the system forever. Even if people have left refugee camps or have resettled, the data stays there, which can cause a lot of issues because of this notion of infrastructuring that I'm going to explain with you in a minute. Because I think as biometrics underpins a range of practices, we really begin that it changes the nature of aid. And I think what we're seeing here is this phenomenon of infrastructuring, which I prefer to the notion of datafication, for example, or digitization, because I don't think what we're seeing here is simply a form of ID provided digitally, or it's a form of datafied identity. I think what we're seeing is this underpinning of services of the whole humanitarian space by biometric technologies and digital technologies more broadly. And these systems are not humanitarian systems. They are systems that are privately run, because they're private companies that have designed them and often maintain them. And at the same time, they can also be compatible or interoperable with government systems, or sometimes they are part of government systems as well. So you can see here that there is a whole infrastructure that underpins humanitarianism that begins to open up humanitarianism to the state, but also to market forces, which kind of challenges this sacrosanct principle, right, of humanitarian independence, because humanitarianism is supposed to be independent from the state, the market, and so on. But once these infrastructures begin to underpin humanitarianism, how can we then claim this kind of principle of independence? How can we even claim the principle of humanity? Because again, humanity means that everybody deserves aid, regardless of where they are, regardless of their religion, their gender, their age, their race. But if you create a conditionality that aid depends on giving your biometric data, is this kind of notion of humanity reworked in any way? So we see this kind of porosity of humanitarianism that emerges because of this infrastructuring. But then there are other consequences of this infrastructuring that I'll try to explain in a minute, starting with this idea of experimentation, which I think is key to what is happening in a lot of refugee camps, which have, you may have come across this notion that refugee camps are sort of laboratories for experimentation. And we have seen lots of pilots involving chatbots for refugees, or algorithmic decision making about who deserves aid and who doesn't. And experimentation, of course, reflects experimentation that was, pharmacological experimentation or medical experimentation of the early 20th century, where people in the majority world were considered to be ready subjects for pilots and for trying out new processes. And this kind of power geometry is kind of reproduced in the contemporary context. So, just to show you how this power geometry is reproduced, my survey of 49 AI applications in the humanitarian sector in 2021-22 revealed that all of them were run by organizations either in North America or in Western Europe. And this is also evident in hackathons, which are sites for kind of the design of some of these pilots, like chatbots. So this is a particular chatbot that was designed, or a hackathon, which was called to design a chatbot for the World Food Programme, and it was held in New York. And this is, again, typical of these events. During my fieldwork, I went to 10 hackathons, between 2016 and 2021. And again, I didn't or hardly ever met refugees in these settings. So this is the chatbot that was produced from the previous hackathon, which is the World Food Programme Foodbot, which is actually in English and has been rolled out in Nigeria and other camps in Africa. Chatbots are really a good exemplar of this kind of experimentation. And I think they're really important because they also bring to the sort of to the foreground the notion of the question of language, which is so important. So the language in which chatbots operate is crucial. We know from the work of decolonial scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o that language constitutes the body of values through which we perceive ourselves and our place in the world. So even if a chatbot is translated in the local language, if it has been trained in English, right? And if the classifications on which it is based are also English, reflect, Western values, then you really see that there is this kind of Eurocentric understanding of the world that is imposed in a local setting. And this is particularly concerning when we look at chatbots that offer, for example, psychotherapy services or provide education, because I think perhaps, and even informational chatbots can raise concerns, but it's particularly problematic, I think, when we look at those chatbots that provide mental health support or education. So, we know from post-colonial scholars who have questioned psychiatric classifications for being Eurocentric. So to produce a mental health chatbot to deal with, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, when refugees are in the trauma, right, they are fleeing war, is really, I think, it speaks volumes about how disconnected some of these chatbots are from the populations that they're trying to address. So where I am. So we're not really looking just at a process of extraction, which I think you can see in these two slides here, which refer to a mental health chatbot, which received a lot of publicity in outlets like The Guardian and The New Yorker. What we really, I think, see, and the deeper problem here is that this is a form of epistemic violence. This is imposition of a very Eurocentric framework on local cultures, which have very different idioms of emotions, very different understandings of what is illness, what is health, and that is the really problematic practice here. Now, the harm of experimentation. Do I have 5 more minutes, or quickly? Okay. The most I think harmful part of experimentation is in this phenomenon of surreptitious experimentation, which is really explained through this notion of infrastructuring that I tried to sort of capture earlier, because if experimentation takes place in the infrastructural background, it remains hidden, and therefore it is unannounced. It has no boundaries. It has no consent, no accountability, and yet it operates in plain sight. So when, for example, algorithmic decision-making to determine who deserves aid in refugee camps and who doesn't was introduced in camps, it was, people were not really asked to sign up to a pilot stage. It was simply the new mode of delivering aid, right? And similarly, when biometric systems or blockchain systems are introduced in camps, they were not announced as being in a pilot stage. They are just simply introduced as the new way through which aid is delivered. So this is really what I mean by surreptitious experimentation. The fact that a lot of these experiments, because they take place in the infrastructural background, they're not even announced as pilots. No consent is sought. And of course, there is no accountability, because when something goes wrong, where do you go to seek redress? If the algorithm determines that your family is not eligible for aid, where do you go, and who is there to blame? Is it the data set that was flawed? Is it the government that provided the data set? Is it the coder? Is it the tech company? Is it the NGO? Like, where do you go for redress? It is extremely opaque. But yet these algorithms, even though their probabilities, their outcomes are treated as unambiguous and objective. And this idea of this example of algorithmic decision making is really exemplifies this notion of infrastructural violence, which is essentially a form of structural violence, but it is really an even more diffused and even more indirect form of structural violence, because again, it operates in the background. So and as data and are shared across government and private companies, and errors are reproduced across databases, it's not clear, where the harm comes from, and people cannot really, find where, the harm or the error has originated. So infrastructural violence really results from these data sharing practices and interoperability, and it becomes an even more diffused form of violence, almost like a form of ambient violence, right? Because as these digital infrastructures underpin all services in the camp, they become part of this kind of everyday life infrastructure. They become the ambient environment, as Brian Larkin says. And so it's almost like this form of ambient violence that surrounds people without really being able to pinpoint where the problem started. Of course, there is resistance, as I mentioned earlier, and overt resistance, as we saw with the Rohingya protest, and there are many other examples of overt protest, but also mundane resistance, as I call it, because in very asymmetrical settings like refugee camps, we can't really, we need ways to understand resistance that takes place below the radar, not in overt ways, which, to outright dissent is often prohibitive in very asymmetrical settings. So I was really trying to capture how can we understand resistance in these more mundane contexts, in this more muted context, in these more muted ways, in the very asymmetrical settings. And I drew here on the Black radical tradition to help me kind of develop a notion of resistance. And I know Orlando Patterson and Cedric Robinson, talk about passive resistance, but I felt there's nothing passive if you refuse to use a chatbot. So it's a form of resistance. It's in a different voice, and it needs to be recognized as an active form of resistance. So I thought mundane resistance might be a better way to capture that. Of course, there's no resistance when it comes to refugee registrations, because, as I said before, there could be some, but it's not very easy to refuse something when you have no alternatives for survival. So there are gradations here of exclusion and agency within humanitarian structures, and we need to be aware of that. I just want to end with an example from my current work. As I said, I've been working in a refugee camp in Thailand, and within that research, we were using participatory arts methods to try to get our interlocutors to express their experiences with biometric systems, but also imagine alternative futures. And this art that was produced was so powerful that we decided it needed to be seen by the world, not just us as researchers. So we have hosted a range of exhibitions, starting in the camp, then in Chiang Mai, now in London, and it will go back to Bangkok from January. But until next Wednesday, you can see this exhibition at Goldsmiths. So if you happen to be in London, you're very welcome. So this is, a day in the exhibition, but you can see some of the drawings there as well. And we have a website where you can see some of that work too. So this is an example of, again, of agency and resistance, because this art is full of, is so rich in terms of how it really encapsulates and reveals and visualizes the agency of refugees, our interlocutors and friends. So, of course, when I talk about agency, I'm not canceling what I said earlier about structural violence. Of course, not the same way structural violence doesn't obliterate human agency. Mundane resistance doesn't reverse the relations of power, but unless we recognize people's agency, how can we ever hope for any social and political change? So even though the micropolitics of everyday life do not reverse power relations, they can plant the seeds for decolonial struggle to come. I also don't want to suggest that the onus is on people to reverse these asymmetrical power relations. The priority should be to abolish the conditions that lead to technological interventions, and this is a wider political project. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirca. Such a nice way to finish the presentation with this art exhibition. And I'll see if I manage to go to London and see, because it looks very nice, and it's a very nice. I think art is a very nice way of showing our research as well as academics. So so now we start the Q&A session, and I want to take my agency as the convener of this event, And I have like two questions. So first of all, like thank you very much for this presentation and for all your work. I think it shows very interestingly how technology is nowadays used in refugee camps. And as you know, I also like did this kind of research when I was at King's with Professor Claudia Ardao, and I also saw how like states are instrumentalizing this technology in order to use their power in order to like control their sort of life. So the first question I had is, so you are using technocolonialism as like the main theoretical framework of your work, and I was wondering when I was listening at your presentation, which kind of like differences are between like technocolonialism and digital colonialism. How do you see like these differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is room for all these different terms. I think there are nuances. I think that technocolonialism, I mean, I've been writing about this for some time now. I think the first paper came out in 2018. And I was really trying to capture this convergence of state power, humanitarian bureaucracies, and market forces. I often feel that perhaps in some other writing on digital colonialism, the emphasis is very much on the role of big tech and technology companies and data, which of course is really important, but I would really say that, and I hope it's clear from my talk here, that this isn't just about big tech, but it's really about how, particular dynamics in humanitarianism and also, of course, its own colonial histories come together with particular state agendas and forms of state power and finds ready friends in tech companies. So I think it's this dynamic that I'm trying to capture. And very much this work is about understanding these inequities between what we call global north and global south. So I would never use technocolonialism to try to understand my predicament or anybody's predicament in Oxford, for example, or in Cambridge, although of course there is we encounter digital capitalism and our extraction of data. But I think when I use the term technocolonialism, I'm trying to understand something about these contexts, which are very much in the global south, and then their relationship with institutions in the global north. So I think that fundamental inequity is at the heart of what I'm trying to capture.
That makes sense. Yeah, these sort of like asymmetries between states, tech companies, all humanitarian organizations,
and the emphasis on violence, I think, is the other thing that I find is kind of quite foregrounded in the notion of technocolonialism. But I think there's room for all the terms because each one is trying to capture something slightly different. So I don't know. That's my take.
Thank you for your answer. So we have your question.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think this is a really interesting approach. Two questions. One is, I mean, in these very large flows of people, you need some kind of ID. I mean, you can't just be ID-less. So what would an ID look like that's not technocolonialist? The second question is about China. China is, I'm not sure if it's in the global south or in the global north. But some of these technologies, as you know, I mean, some of the AI technologies are now Chinese. Are they Eurocentric, Western-centric, racist in various ways? I mean, how do you see that through your lens? Because that has a very different history. You talked about continuities. Is China a new empire? I mean, it was half colonialized. Who knows? I mean, how does that fit into your picture?
Yeah, great questions. So I completely agree that there is a need for a form of identification. And this is precisely why I'm doing the current project, because the project is called Reimagining Digital Identity, because we recognize that having a form of legal recognition is the absolute priority for people in the camps. It's not a niche subject. Without an ID, people cannot get out to the camps. They cannot come back in. They can't get a job. But what they need is a form of fair and digital and responsible ID. I mean, we were funded by the British Academy's stream on what is responsible technologies, responsible AI. So that's the effort. And the participatory arts workshops were one of the ways through which we were trying to understand what would be a fair and socially just ID from the point of view of refugees, because our perspective was that you cannot develop a fair digital ID unless you ask the communities that are concerned, right? So that was what we were trying to capture with the artwork, and what comes out from this artwork and the interviews, because we've interviewed 200 people. What comes out very clearly from our field work is that people need a form of ID. Well, first of all, they need legal recognition. What they have now is authentication without recognition. It's paradoxical, right? You have to, prove who you are several times a day, but you haven't got the fundamental thing, which is a legal ID. So these are not substitutes for the, legal ID for all, the Sustainable Development Goal. It's just not at all that. So people want recognition, and then they also want an ID that would allow them to work locally, with dignity and have some form of mobility. It's a small thing. And if I have time, my favorite drawing from that work is by a young man who has a small drawing. I don't have it sadly in the slide, but it's called Football. And so when I was chatting with him after he made the drawing, because part of our methodology was to record people and people's accounts after they're completing their artwork. So I said, what is this football pitch down here? What is this about? And he said, well, my dream, he said, is I want to be able to get out of the camp so I can go to the nearby village and play football, and without being arrested. And I realized that, because he's a new arrival, he's come after the coup in 2021, the coup in Myanmar, he doesn't have any rights. So he has no papers, he cannot get out of the camp. And therefore, this very small thing, this very ordinary thing that most people will take for granted, like to be able to play football, for him is the dream. And I think this is very poignant. So, and I think this really encapsulates what he really wants is this form of recognition. And ultimately, it's not the technology that needs to be fixed here, although of course we can fix this. We can have a fair or a better designed technological system, but also what he needs is social justice. He wants basically, not to be arrested. He wants the hostile environment not to be there. So I hope that answers your question, that it's not just about fixing the technology, but it's also really pushing for social justice for some of these people. The China question is really interesting. I mean, as I say in the book, when I talk about colonialism, I also talk about internalization of colonialism. So India, for instance, in its Aadhaar system, you could say, well, how could that be understood through a colonial lens? Although I don't talk about that because it's not humanitarian. But actually, it's really interesting how India has internalized some of these humanitarian bureaucracies, right? The bureaucracies of empire. And many authors write about that, like Akhil Gupta in his book Red Tape really captures that so well. And there's a great book by Sylvia Lindner on how China has also internalized some of these colonial legacies and imposes it in its own forms of innovation. So I think that's a really interesting argument about China. The other interesting thing about China is that even though there's not a lot of discussion of who's going to fill the gap of USAID, this absence of the US, which has dominated the aid sector for so many decades, China is not rushing. It's very present in Southeast Asia, like it's the most dominant force. If you want to understand China's power, go to Southeast Asia, especially in the borderlands, but it's not really stepping in as a humanitarian partner. So it's not really involved in these programs, at least so far, although I know it's obviously developing AI and so on. But I think the interesting argument here is this internalization, and the best book I would suggest on that is Sylvia Lindner's book on innovation in China. Sorry, I've been taking too long.
We have no questions. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. Mike.
They do tweet you want the link.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it doesn't. Okay, cool. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk more about the resistance that you've seen and like if there's any successful resistances that would be interesting case studies that we could learn from? Or yeah, what are like the similarities and differences of resisting technocolonialism versus earlier resistances to colonialism?
Yeah. So I have multiple examples in the book.
Thank you.
Apart from, I mentioned refusal earlier, but we have examples also of how people appropriate technologies in unexpected ways. So this is from my fieldwork in Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, where humanitarian radio, which was also digitally delivered, was and it was one of its purposes was to capture feedback from communities, but people actually appropriated this in different ways. So they really used that feedback mechanism through sending messages for the 2-hour karaoke slot on Sunday. So the humanitarian radio is unlike any other type of radio, which is, with music and so on. The humanitarian radio is just a series of announcements. It's quite dry. It's very functional and very sort of, it serves that particular informational purpose. But there was a 2-hour slot on Sundays with music where people the presenters would have their guitars and would play songs that had been requested by the audience. And that's what most messages were for. They were requests for songs. And for me, that was such an interesting example of how, what mattered to people was this return to ordinariness. When they had lost everything, they had lost their home, there had been thousands of people that had been killed, bodies hadn't been found. People wanted a return to their life before, and they wanted also to rebuild their bonds with their loved ones. And so they were asking for dedications. It wasn't just requests for songs, but they were dedicating songs to their relatives. So it was this bond building effort, and that's an oppositional appropriation. If I have a minute, the most successful example of resisting these kind of biometric initiatives comes from Ukraine, actually. And I think that's also telling that it's not coming from a country in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America. But so there was a campaign to stop biometric registrations. And it was led by activists, NGOs, but also the Ukrainian government itself. And there was GDPR legislation was actually used as part of this argument that because Ukrainian refugees were in European countries like Poland and Romania, they did not have their biometric data taken, but internally displaced people within Ukraine did. And the argument was that you cannot treat Ukrainian refugees differently if they are in Europe, in EU territory or in Ukraine. And the argument was won, and the biometric registration stopped. Although biometrics are still used, but they're not new registrations that are taking place. And so this is a good example of how if you have a partnership between activists, NGOs, different bodies come together, you can actually push back and stop some of these kind of worst examples. But, I think geopolitically, where Ukraine is, I think speaks volumes about why this was successful and why we haven't seen something similar in other parts of the world. And we should try really to have more efforts like that. Thank you.
We have more time or?
Yeah, we are out of time, but
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. I just want to ask for your opinion that from what I hear as well, I think one of the arguments is that the aid sector is kind of like the extension of like colonialism. But do you have any kind of like suggestion for the aid sector's officers or like the UN Secretary, for example, like how to improve the situation or like just to eradicate aid sector totally, or what's any suggestions?
That's a great question too. I just want to say that the aid sector is, it is a very reflexive sector and has been undergoing sort of a constant process of reform, and efforts around localization, I think, are indicative of that. The problem why a lot of these don't work is that ultimately they're not radical enough. So instead of really having true localization, whereby you really empower communities to determine what aid would look like from their point of view, ultimately, localization means that you employ local people, but the directive or the policy comes from headquarters somewhere in a global minority context. So that is not really truly meaningful localization. I understand that there is something fundamentally asymmetrical in aid, and it's very hard to reform it because, unless you really, you really need a new power geometry there, a new power, configuration. Because if you have that asymmetry, that colonial logic and genealogy is going to be always reproduced. But I don't think, and of course we should do away with aid. That would be ideal. But what do you do until then, right? You need something. You need those structures in place, and so I think meaningful localization, more radical policies from that point of view, and perhaps an opening up to questions around social justice, which of course, that has been anathema to humanitarians. But I think, what I think comes clearly across in the book is that there is really no neutrality. It becomes a bit of an illusion. I can understand the importance of, it's very difficult to give a nuanced answer in 1 minute, but I understand the importance of neutrality and the fact that, it protects also humanitarian workers who are working in very difficult conditions and conflicts and so on. But on the other hand, we know from countless examples that it's not really achieved in practice because neutrality often favors the strongest actor. And so I think, an opening up to questions of social justice and human rights is one thought I have at the end of the book, where I talk what can be done. There's a section where I address that, and I think having more radical localization policies is the other aspect.
Thank you very much. So we're
Okay.
gonna close the
Yeah.
this reflection. So thank you, Mirca.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.